For decades, Gene Simmons has built a career out of saying the unsayable. He gave himself a nickname built on outrage and wore it proudly. He boasted about the fortune, the long list of women, and an empire he never once apologized for. For a long time that was simply his act, the cost of being a rock icon. But in early 2025, he made a comparison so offensive that even fans who had defended him for 40 years finally fell silent. Then the lawsuits started piling up, the accusations multiplied, and his reputation began to unravel in a way no one could fully explain. Now, the real story behind the man inside the demon makeup is finally coming into focus. Before he was Gene Simmons, he was Chaim Witz, born on August 25, 1949 in Haifa. His childhood took shape mostly in Tirat Carmel, a modest working-class town outside the city, where daily life was plain and repetitive, the kind of routine that quietly shapes a child before he's even aware of it. But the deepest weight in that household didn't come from the town or from money. It came from history. His parents, Ferenc Witz and Flora Klein, were Hungarian Jews who had lived through the horrors of Nazi persecution. His mother had survived Auschwitz as a teenager and lost nearly her entire family inside its walls. Those memories never stayed in the past. They lived inside the house, surfacing in stories, in long silences, and in the constant, unspoken sense that survival itself was fragile. That environment shaped him from the start. He grew up absorbing stories about cattle cars, tattooed numbers, starvation, and the terrifying randomness of who lived and who didn't. Most children hearing stories like that would simply feel sorrow. For young Chaim, the impact went further. Those stories taught him that safety could disappear in an instant. They taught him that control was essential. And they taught him that money wasn't just comfort, it was armor. His parents' marriage eventually fell apart, and his mother raised him alone from then on. She reclaimed her maiden name, and together they became the Kleins, a small but meaningful shift, a sign that the past still had its grip on their lives and that identity itself could bend when circumstances demanded it. Then came the decision that would reshape everything. In 1958, Flora sold nearly everything the family owned in Israel and bought 2 one-way tickets to the United States. It was a gamble that must have felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary. Mother and son landed in New York through Idlewild Airport, later renamed JFK. Chaim was only 8 or 9 years old, and what greeted him wasn't the glittering America of postcards and movies. It was Queens, cramped apartments, tight budgets, and working-class blocks where every dollar had to be accounted for. They settled first in Jackson Heights before moving through a series of other modest neighborhoods, rebuilding a life from almost nothing. For the young boy, the culture shock hit immediately. He barely spoke a word of English. In the classroom, he could hardly follow what his teachers or classmates were saying. On his very first day at an American public school, he responded to a question in Hebrew and Hungarian while the other children laughed. A moment like that can break a child's confidence, or it can forge something harder in him. In his case, it seems to have done both. He felt the sting of humiliation and the gulf that separated him from everyone around him. But at the same time, something clicked into place. He decided he was going to conquer this new world, its language, its rhythms, its unwritten rules, and he was going to do it quickly. So he taught himself, not through formal lessons, but by soaking up everything American culture put in front of him. He devoured secondhand comic books. He watched endless television reruns. He listened to radio disc jockeys and mimicked the way they talked. Piece by piece, he studied America like a puzzle waiting to be solved. This wasn't just about picking up vocabulary. He was teaching himself how to belong. He was studying how heroes carried themselves, how confidence was performed, how attention was captured and held. Quietly, without anyone realizing it, the foundations of Gene Simmons were already being laid in Queens, long before the makeup, the platform boots, or a single sold-out arena. As he entered his teens in the mid-1960s, that drive only intensified. Nothing came easily or glamorously. He balanced school with a string of low-paying jobs, taking whatever work he could find, including a stretch as a deli assistant. Later, after earning degrees from Sullivan County Community College and Richmond College, he even spent a short time working as a 6th-grade teacher in Harlem, a detail that still surprises people today, given how far it seems from the demon persona the world would come to know. But it fits the larger pattern of his youth: constant movement, constant self-testing, always searching for a bigger path forward. Music was already calling to him through all of this. Around 1964 and 1965, he started performing with local New York bands carrying names like Lynx, Missing Links, Long Island Sounds, and Bullfrog Beer. These weren't legendary acts by any stretch. They were rough, semi-professional groups scraping together cheap gigs across Queens and Manhattan, playing to tiny, indifferent crowds for almost no money. Even so, he brought an unusual level of focus to those nights. Most young musicians simply dream their way through rehearsals and stumble through performances. He, slowly transforming from Hyman to Gene, watched everything closely. He paid attention to which songs made the crowd clap along, which hooks convinced a skeptical bar owner to book them a second time, and which moments in a set actually sold tickets. A 3-minute song wasn't just music to him, it was an experiment. The crowd gave you an honest answer every single night if you were paying attention. That habit became one of the cornerstones of everything that came later. He wasn't only learning to perform, he was learning how desire itself operated. He was studying how people responded to image, sound, timing, and repetition. In other words, long before he had the resources to act on it, he had already started viewing rock and roll as both an art form and a business. His transformation happened in layers. After the family's arrival in America, the boy born Witz took his mother's surname and became Gene Klein. It was a small but deliberate choice. Gene was short, simple, and easy for English speakers to pronounce, which helped him navigate a country where teachers and strangers constantly stumbled over Haim. Later, by the close of the 1960s, he dropped Klein entirely and adopted the name Gene Simmons, reportedly inspired in part by the rockabilly performer known as Jumping Gene Simmons. The name sounded sharp, American, and built for a marquee. That wasn't accidental. He understood even then that a name shapes a first impression, and he wanted one built to travel. By this point, he was no longer simply trying to blend into American life. He was constructing a version of himself capable of rising far above the ordinary. Dark hair, a harder edge in his expression, and a growing theatrical instinct all started coming together. He wasn't just thinking about songs anymore, he was thinking about image, memory, and ownership. A stage name he realized could become a brand. A face could become a symbol. The instinct for monetizing identity, something people would later discuss endlessly, was already forming. The next turning point arrived when he crossed paths with Stanley Harvey Eisen, the future Paul Stanley, introduced through a mutual guitarist friend, Steve Coronel, within New York's small, tight-knit rock scene. Their meeting reshaped both of their futures, because each recognized something essential in the other. Both were driven. Both were restless. Both wanted something far bigger than local bar gigs and half-finished dreams. Around 1970, the two formed a group first called Rainbow, which quickly evolved into Wicked Lester. The lineup featured Simmons on bass, Stanley on guitar, Coronel on lead guitar, Brooke Ostrander on keyboards, and Tony Zarella on drums. By 1971, Wicked Lester had landed a deal with Epic Records and recorded a full album at Electric Lady Studios, the storied studio associated with Jimi Hendrix. For a young band, that should have felt like a triumphant beginning. In a sense, it was also a failure. The label ultimately shelved the record, viewing the band's blend of folk, pop, and rock as scattered and unfocused. Many musicians would have been devastated by that outcome. Simmons and Stanley treated it instead as a valuable lesson. They realized talent alone wasn't enough, and that style without a sharp, unifying identity would simply disappear into the noise. They needed something harder-edged. They needed a concept audiences could recognize instantly and never forget. So in 1972, they dissolved Wicked Lester and moved toward something far more calculated. By January 1973, they had re-emerged under a new name, Kiss. This wasn't a cosmetic rebrand, it was a strategic one, and Simmons stood right at the center of that shift. Kiss played its debut show on January 30, 1973, at the Popcorn Club in Queens. The venue was tiny. According to reports, fewer than 10 paying customers were present, along with a handful of uninterested regulars at the bar. It was hardly the kind of night that foreshadows an entertainment empire. And yet something significant happened on that small stage. 4 unknown musicians from New York walked into a room that barely acknowledged their presence, and performed as though they were already legends. Gene was already sculpting the persona that would define the rest of his life. His early makeup was crude, far from the polished version fans would later recognize, but the concept was unmistakably there. He practiced a menacing stillness on stage while holding his bass low. The band ran through several sets that night and walked away with roughly $50. He even attempted early fire breathing using lighter fluid, alarming the club's owner in the process. That single moment revealed a lot about his ambitions. He wanted more than a typical bar band experience. He wanted spectacle. He wanted danger. He wanted the audience to feel like something untamed had just walked into the room. The makeup itself soon became central to the band's identity. Simmons and Stanley refused to let Kiss blend in as just another band fighting for attention in a crowded city. They wanted to look like living comic book characters, part monster, part myth, part exaggerated version of themselves. Simmons sketched out what would become his now iconic demon face, using sharp black lines and dramatic eye shapes to create a menacing, almost otherworldly appearance. He added towering platform boots, bat-inspired armor, and his now famous tongue, deployed with theatrical flair. He experimented relentlessly with fire-breathing and blood-spitting, rehearsing these dangerous stunts in cramped New York apartments and rehearsal spaces despite the very real risks, burns, choking, and countless things that could go horribly wrong. He kept pushing forward anyway, understanding instinctively that fear and fascination make powerful partners on a stage. Kiss's persistence began paying off. On March 19, 1975, the band released their third studio album, Dressed to Kill, through Casablanca Records. The label desperately needed a hit, and the pressure on the band was real. The album ran under 30 minutes total, but tucked inside it was the song that would reshape the band's entire trajectory, Rock and Roll All Night. Built around a Paul Stanley riff and a chorus Gene helped mold into an instant party anthem, the studio version didn't explode commercially right away. Still, it carried the essential DNA of what Kiss was becoming: direct, loud, chantable, and engineered for massive crowds. It was the live version released on the Alive album that turned the song into a top 20 US single. From there, it became something closer to a ritual. Night after night, Gene, playing the blood-spitting demon, led thousands of fans into that chorus until it stopped feeling like a song and became a shared experience. That breakthrough set the stage for the band's next major leap. On March 15, 1976, Kiss released Destroyer, their fourth studio album, produced by Bob Ezrin. With more momentum and financial backing behind them thanks to Alive. The record debuted on the Billboard 200 at number 81 in early April before climbing to number 11 by mid-year, staying on the charts for a remarkable 84 weeks. It became the band's first platinum album in America. Tracks like Detroit Rock City, Shout It Out Loud, and Beth proved the group could expand its range without losing its core identity, delivering heavy rock energy, massive choruses, and even softer, more vulnerable moments, all without diluting the image they'd built. On stage, Gene kept pushing the demon persona to new extremes. He rose above the crowd on hydraulic platforms. He breathed fire as songs kicked off. He made himself appear larger than life, dangerous and impossible to look away from. By this point, Kiss wasn't simply a rock band winning over new fans. It had become a full-blown spectacle. And arguably no one in the group understood the value of that spectacle better than Gene Simmons himself. From the mid-1970s onward, Simmons treated Kiss less like a band and more like a franchise. Where most groups focus primarily on songs, tours, and album sales, Simmons focused on ownership. He thought constantly about what could be licensed, what could be sold, and what could live on far beyond a single concert. Face paint designs, logos, guitar picks, boots, posters, comic books, lunchboxes, pinball machines, and a staggering number of other products all became part of the growing Kiss commercial machine. Over the years, the number of licensed products climbed into the thousands. By the early 2000s, estimates suggested the band had generated not only tens of millions in album sales, but also more than $1 billion in merchandise revenue. That approach fundamentally changed how the music business operated. Fans weren't just buying records anymore, they were buying entry into an entire world. Simmons guarded that world aggressively. Trademarks mattered enormously to him. Logos mattered. The demon face mattered. Even the visual details of the band's equipment and stage design mattered. He recognized, perhaps earlier than almost anyone else in rock, that image could be just as valuable as music itself, provided it was built carefully and defended relentlessly. Then came one of the boldest moves in the band's entire history. On June 18, 1983, after a full decade of hiding behind elaborate makeup, Kiss appeared on MTV and revealed their faces to the public, the first time they had performed without makeup since 1973. For Simmons, removing the demon mask meant gambling with one of the most recognizable visual identities in the history of rock music. Still, the timing made sense. Album sales had declined following Dynasty and Unmasked, and even the band's darker Creatures of the Night era hadn't delivered the comeback they needed. The musical landscape had shifted. MTV was now a dominant force. Glam metal was surging in popularity. Visibility mattered in an entirely different way than it had a decade earlier. The unmasking then became less about reinvention for its own sake and more about survival, a calculated move to keep Kiss relevant in a changed era. From there, the band pivoted again. Lick It Up arrived in September 1983 and became their first gold record in years. The lineup continued to shift around them. Vinnie Vincent came and went, Mark St. John briefly joined before health problems forced him out, and Bruce Kulick eventually stepped in to help stabilize the group. Throughout much of this stretch, Simmons also branched into film roles and other business ventures, expanding his public profile well beyond the band itself. Paul Stanley often took on more of the day-to-day musical leadership during this period, while Simmons focused on keeping his name, face, and persona circulating throughout popular culture at large. Eventually, the pull of nostalgia brought the classic image roaring back. On April 16, 1996, Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Ace Frehley, and Peter Criss reunited in full 1970s-style makeup aboard the USS Intrepid in New York, announcing a complete reunion tour. The announcement reached audiences across dozens of countries, and the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The very first show sold nearly 40,000 tickets in just 47 minutes. When the Alive/Worldwide Tour officially launched at Detroit's Tiger Stadium on June 28, 1996, close to 40,000 fans packed the venue. Across 192 shows, the tour grossed tens of millions of dollars and made Kiss the top-earning concert act of that entire year. The message was unmistakable. The old image still carried extraordinary power, and the Demon still knew exactly how to command a crowd. By June 13, 2001, Kiss had earned a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. For Simmons, that moment carried layers of meaning few people could fully appreciate. He had arrived in New York as the son of a Holocaust survivor, unable to speak a word of English, uncertain of where, or whether, he truly belonged. Now, a character he had helped invent had become a permanent piece of American pop culture history. By that point, the band had sold more than 35 million albums in the United States alone, and over 100 million worldwide. Few American rock acts had ever built a legacy of that scale and staying power. Then, on April 10, 2014, the four original members were formally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame at Brooklyn's Barclays Center. A final, official recognition of the empire that had started decades earlier in a nearly empty room at the Popcorn Club, built by a boy who once answered his first American classroom question in Hebrew and Hungarian while his classmates laughed. That's the arc that led to everything. The fortune, the fame, the trademark tongue and painted face, and eventually, the controversies that would follow him decades later. But to understand how a Holocaust survivor's son became one of rock's most calculated showmen, you have to start exactly where his story did. In a small house in Israel, haunted by history, and in a cramped apartment in Queens, where an 8-year-old boy decided he would never again feel powerless.